In August 2015, a group of recreational divers was exploring a section of Kentucky Lake near the town of Aurora, searching for interesting underwater features to document for their diving club. The lake, one of the largest man-made bodies of water in the United States, was created in 1944 when the Tennessee Valley Authority dammed the Tennessee River. Beneath its calm surface lay a drowned landscape, old roads, foundations of buildings, even entire forests of trees still standing upright underwater. At a depth of 18 feet in water cold enough to slow decomposition, one of the divers spotted something that didn't belong. A shape too geometric, too manufactured. As he swam closer, his underwater camera capturing everything, the object revealed itself. A car. Not just any car, but a Volkswagen Beetle sitting upright on the lake bottom as if it had simply been parked there. The car was remarkably intact considering its age. The distinctive curved body of the Beetle was unmistakable, even covered in decades of algae and sediment. The paint, once bright blue, was still faintly visible beneath the growth, and, most significantly, when the diver shone his light through the murky window, he could see skeletal remains in the driver's compartment. If mysteries that remain hidden for generations fascinate you, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened to Matthew Smith on March 15, 1968, will show you how easily someone can vanish, even when they're exactly where people should have been looking. This is the story of a talented mechanic who loved his car more than anything except his family. This is the story of a wife who waited 47 years for answers. And this is the story of a son who grew up without his father, never knowing that all this time his dad was 18 feet underwater, less than 5 miles from where they lived. Matthew Allen Smith was 32 years old in the spring of 1968, a man who understood machines better than he understood people. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall with a stocky, solid build developed from years of physical work. His hair was sandy blonde, usually disheveled because he was always running his hands through it while thinking about some mechanical problem. His hands were permanently stained with grease and oil. No amount of scrubbing could fully clean them, but Matthew didn't mind. Those stains were badges of honor, proof of honest work. Matthew had been born in Paducah, Kentucky in 1936, the youngest of 4 children in a working-class family. His father worked at the railroad yards. His mother took in sewing. They didn't have much money, but they had enough. Matthew showed mechanical aptitude early, taking apart his mother's vacuum cleaner at age 7 to see how it worked. He put it back together too, which impressed his father enough to start teaching him about engines and tools. By the time Matthew was 16, he could diagnose and fix almost any mechanical problem with a car. He dropped out of high school in his senior year, not because he was struggling academically, but because he'd been offered a full-time position at Thompson's Garage, the busiest auto repair shop in Paducah. He figured he'd learn more working than sitting in a classroom, and he was right. Matthew worked at Thompson's for 8 years, learning everything he could about automotive repair. He specialized in foreign cars, particularly Volkswagens, which were becoming increasingly popular in the 1960s. The simplicity and reliability of VW engineering appealed to Matthew's practical nature. When most mechanics were intimidated by the rear-engine air-cooled design, Matthew saw it as elegant problem-solving. In 1960, at age 24, Matthew opened his own business, Smith's Auto Repair, located on Broadway Street in downtown Paducah. The shop was small, just 2 bays and a tiny office, but Matthew quickly built a reputation for honest work at fair prices. He specialized in Volkswagens, and people drove from surrounding counties to have him work on their Beetles, buses, and Karmann Ghias. Matthew's pride and joy was his own car, a 1965 Volkswagen Beetle in a distinctive shade of light blue that he'd special ordered from the factory. He had purchased it new in 1965 and immediately began modifying it. He upgraded the engine, installed better suspension, added custom seats, and maintained it with obsessive care. The Beetle wasn't just transportation for Matthew, it was a rolling advertisement for his skills, proof that he knew Volkswagens better than anyone. In 1963, Matthew married Linda Hayes, a waitress at the local diner where he ate lunch most days. Linda was 26, with auburn hair and a laugh that Matthew said could brighten the worst day. She understood that Matthew's first love was cars, but she was comfortable being his second love. She knew he'd always come home to her, even if he spent 12 hours a day at the shop. Their son, Danny, was born in 1965. From the moment Danny could walk, he followed his father around the garage, watching Matthew work, learning tool names, absorbing everything. Matthew would lift Danny up so he could see inside engine compartments, explaining how everything worked in a patient, gentle voice that he used for almost no one else. By 1968, Matthew's business was thriving. He had steady customers, his reputation was solid, and he was able to provide a comfortable, if modest, life for Linda and Danny. They lived in a small house on Kentucky Avenue, a 10-minute drive from the shop. Matthew's routine was predictable. Shop by 7 in the morning, home for lunch around noon, back to the shop until 6 in the evening, then home for dinner with his family. Matthew was known as a quiet man, not unfriendly, but not particularly social. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't have hobbies outside of cars. His world was contained in a small radius: his shop, his home, his family, and his Beetle. People who knew him said Matthew was content. He'd found his place in the world. But Matthew had one quirk that friends and family found amusing. He loved to drive. Not to go anywhere specific, just to drive. 2 or 3 times a week, after closing the shop, Matthew would take his Beetle out on the highways around Paducah, driving fast on the empty roads, testing modifications he'd made to the engine or suspension. He'd drive out toward Kentucky Lake, following Highway 60 through the curves and hills, pushing the little car to its limits, then drive home satisfied. "It's meditation," he told Linda once when she asked why he did it. "Everything makes sense when I'm driving. All the noise in my head gets quiet." Linda didn't fully understand, but she accepted it. Matthew would leave around 4 in the afternoon, drive for an hour or two, and be home by 6 or 6:30 for dinner. It was part of his routine, as regular as his morning coffee. March 15, 1968, was a Friday. The weather was poor, overcast, and rainy, the kind of gray Kentucky spring day that feels more like winter than spring. The temperature was in the low 40s, and a steady drizzle had been falling since morning. Matthew opened his shop at 7 in the morning as usual. He had 2 jobs scheduled that day: a tune-up on a 1966 Beetle and a brake job on a 1964 bus. He worked through the morning, finishing both jobs by noon. He drove home in his blue Beetle, ate the lunch Linda had prepared, played with 3-year-old Danny for a few minutes, then headed back to the shop. Around 2 in the afternoon, Matthew decided to test drive his own Beetle. He'd made some adjustments to the carburetor earlier in the week and wanted to see how the car performed under load. Despite the rain, despite the poor visibility, Matthew decided to take his usual drive out toward Kentucky Lake. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Matthew locked up the shop and headed out on Highway 60, driving east toward the lake. The road was wet, the visibility poor, but Matthew had driven this route hundreds of times. He knew every curve, every hill. He wasn't worried. At 6 in the evening, when Matthew didn't arrive home for dinner, Linda wasn't immediately concerned. Sometimes Matthew lost track of time when he was working on a car. Sometimes he stayed late to finish a job. She fed Danny, kept Matthew's dinner warm, and waited. By 7 in the evening, she was worried. Matthew had never been this late without calling. She called the shop. No answer. She called Matthew's brother, William, who lived across town. He hadn't seen Matthew. She called Thompson's garage, thinking maybe Matthew had stopped by to borrow a tool. No one had seen him. At 8 in the evening, Linda called the Paducah Police Department. "My husband didn't come home," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He left the shop around 3:30 this afternoon, and he should have been home by 6. He's never late. Something's wrong." The dispatcher took the information. Matthew Allen Smith, 32 years old, driving a light blue 1965 Volkswagen Beetle, Kentucky license plate PCH 847. He'd been missing for approximately 4.5 hours. "We'll send an officer to take a report, ma'am, but I'm sure he's fine. Maybe he had car trouble and couldn't get to a phone." But Linda knew better. Matthew's Beetle didn't break down. Matthew made sure of that.
And even if it had, there were houses all along Highway 60. He could have called. Something was very wrong. March 15, 1968, 9 in the evening. Officer Tom Bradley from the Paducah Police Department sat in Linda Smith's small living room, taking down information about her missing husband. Linda held 3-year-old Danny on her lap, the boy half asleep, sensing his mother's anxiety, but not understanding it. "Tell me about his routine," Bradley said. "He said he liked to drive after work." 2 or 3 times a week, he'd take his Beetle out on Highway 60 toward Kentucky Lake. He'd test things he'd worked on. He'd drive for an hour, maybe 2, then come home. He always made it back by 6 or 6:30 for dinner. "Did he have any reason to not come home tonight? Any problems at work, financial trouble, marital problems?" Linda shook her head firmly. "No, nothing like that. Matthew loved his work. We're doing fine financially, and we're happy. He wouldn't just not come home. Something happened to him." Bradley made notes. He'd been a cop for 12 years and had handled dozens of missing person cases. Most of them resolved within 24 hours. People got distracted, had minor accidents, went somewhere without telling anyone. But something about Linda's certainty bothered him. She wasn't hysterical. She was calm and absolutely convinced something was wrong. "We'll start looking tonight," Bradley said. "I'll put out a bulletin for his car. Officers will patrol Highway 60 and the roads around the lake. If he's broken down somewhere, we'll find him." But the search that night found nothing. Patrol cars drove Highway 60 in both directions from Paducah all the way to the lake, looking for a blue Beetle pulled off on the shoulder. They found nothing. No abandoned car, no signs of an accident, no indication Matthew had been on that road at all. The search intensified on March 16th. The Kentucky State Police were notified. A description of Matthew and his Beetle went out to every law enforcement agency in western Kentucky and southern Illinois. Local radio stations broadcast the information. The Paducah Sun ran a front-page story. Local theme mechanic missing after test drive. Matthew's brother, William, organized a civilian search. By Saturday afternoon, over 100 people were involved, driving every road in McCracken County, looking for a light blue Beetle. They checked every gas station, every diner, every place Matthew might have stopped. They found nothing. On Sunday, March 17th, 2 days after Matthew's disappearance, the search expanded to Kentucky Lake itself. The theory was that Matthew might have driven off the auto road into the water, particularly given the rainy conditions on Friday. But searching a lake with 2,380 miles of shoreline was nearly impossible. The sheriff's department brought in boats to check the areas where Highway 60 ran close to the lake. They looked for disturbed vegetation, skid marks leading to the water, any sign that a car had gone off the road. They found several places where the road curved dangerously close to steep drop-offs into the water, but there was no evidence Matthew had driven off at any of these locations. The problem was that in 1968, underwater search technology was primitive. Sonar existed, but was expensive, unreliable, and rarely available to local law enforcement. Scuba diving was still relatively new to the general public, and few police departments had trained divers on staff. The few civilian divers in the area had limited equipment and could only search in clear, shallow water. Kentucky Lake, with its murky water and unpredictable currents, was dangerous even for experienced divers. Highway 60 ran along the lake's edge for miles, with dozens of curves where a car could potentially leave the road. Each location would require multiple dives in poor visibility to search thoroughly, without a specific area to focus on. Without any evidence pointing to a particular spot, a comprehensive underwater search was simply beyond the capabilities of 1968 law enforcement. Detective Frank Morrison, who was leading the investigation, made the decision on March 20th. "We don't have the resources to search the entire lake," he told Linda and William Smith. "We've checked the most likely locations where a car could have gone into the water. Places where we found disturbed ground or broken vegetation. We found nothing." At this point, we have to consider other possibilities. What other possibilities? Linda asked, her voice sharp with frustration. That Matthew left voluntarily, that he's somewhere else for reasons we don't know. He didn't leave, Linda said firmly. Matthew wouldn't do that. He's in that lake. I know he is. You just haven't found him yet. But without evidence, without any indication of where to look, the search couldn't continue indefinitely. The active search was suspended on March 25th, 10 days after Matthew vanished. The case remained open, but there was nothing more investigators could do. Theories proliferated. Some people suggested Matthew had been in an accident somewhere far from where people were looking, that his car was in a ditch or ravine that hadn't been searched. Others whispered that Matthew had run away, maybe had debts he hadn't told Linda about, maybe had another woman. But those who knew Matthew rejected these theories. Matthew wasn't secretive. Matthew didn't have debts. Matthew loved his family. The most persistent theory, the one Linda believed, was that Matthew had driven off the road into Kentucky Lake during the rainstorm. The roads were slick, visibility was poor, a moment of inattention, a slight overcorrection in a curve, and the Beetle could have plunged into the water before Matthew could react. The car would have sunk quickly. The rear-engine Beetle had a tendency to go nose first into water. Matthew could have been trapped, unable to escape, and drowned in minutes. But if that was what happened, where was the car? Kentucky Lake had been searched, at least the obvious locations had been checked. Where else could he be? The answer, investigators eventually concluded, was that the lake was simply too large, the bottom too irregular, the visibility too poor, and the technology too limited. Highway 60 curved along the lake for miles, with hundreds of potential points where a car could leave the road. They had focused their limited diving resources on locations where there was visible evidence: broken guardrails, disturbed soil, damaged vegetation. But if a car went into the water at a location where rain had washed away the evidence within hours, where the embankment was naturally bare of vegetation, there would be no way to identify that specific spot among hundreds of similar curves. Without better technology, without a specific location to search, finding Matthew's car was impossible. Matthew Smith's disappearance became one of those cases that a community couldn't solve or forget. The Blue Beetle became legendary. For years afterward, people would report seeing it driving on Highway 60 late at night, parked at the lake at dawn, always just out of reach, always vanishing when approached. The ghost car of Kentucky Lake, people called it. But it wasn't a ghost. It was 18 feet underwater, less than a quarter mile from where Highway 60 curved along the lake's edge, sitting upright on the bottom, in a location that had never been thoroughly searched because the shoreline there showed no obvious signs of disturbance after the rain. The impact on the Smith family was devastating. Linda was 31 years old, suddenly a single mother with a 3-year-old son and no clear answers about what had happened to her husband. She received Matthew's life insurance payout after he was declared legally dead in 1975, 7 years after his disappearance. The money helped, but it couldn't fill the void. Danny Smith grew up with a father-shaped hole in his life. He had fragmentary memories, being lifted up to see inside engines, the smell of oil and metal, his father's rough hands, gentle when they touched him. But mostly, Danny remembered absence. He remembered other kids having fathers. He remembered Mother's Day and Father's Day and how his mother would cry quietly on Father's Day every year. Linda tried to move on. She dated occasionally in the 1970s, married briefly in 1976, but divorced after 2 years. No one could replace Matthew. In 1980, she moved to a smaller house, unable to afford the mortgage on Kentucky Avenue. She kept working as a waitress, raising Danny alone, always wondering what had happened that Friday afternoon in March 1968. Danny became a mechanic just like his father. It wasn't a conscious tribute at first. He just found that he understood machines, that working with his hands made sense in a way other work didn't. By the time he was 25, he'd opened his own shop, Smith & Son Auto Repair. Even though the son part was just him, the name was a connection to the father he barely remembered. Over the years, Danny would occasionally drive Highway 60, looking at Kentucky Lake, wondering if his father was down there somewhere. He'd see the memorial his mother had placed at the lake's edge in 1970, a simple stone marker, Matthew A. Smith, 1936 to 1968, beloved husband and father. But there was no body beneath that marker, just hope and grief and unanswered questions. The case went cold. Detective Morrison retired in 1985. The file on Matthew Smith's disappearance gathered dust in the Paducah Police Department's records room. New generations of officers came and went, most never hearing about the mechanic who vanished in 1968. But cases don't stay cold forever. Technology advances. Lakes that couldn't be searched in 1968 become accessible with modern equipment. And sometimes, 47 years later, recreational divers find what professional searchers missed. The 47 years between Matthew Smith's disappearance and the discovery of his car were marked by a family learning to live with ambiguity. Linda Smith never remarried after her brief second marriage ended in 1978. She kept Matthew's wedding photo on her nightstand until the day she died. She kept his toolbox in her garage, unable to throw it away, unable to accept that he was truly gone. "He's out there somewhere," she would say, even decades later. "Somewhere in that lake. I know it is. You just haven't found him yet." But without evidence, without any indication of where to look, the search couldn't continue indefinitely. The active search was suspended on March 25th, 10 days after Matthew vanished. The case remained open, but there was nothing more investigators could do. Theories proliferated. Some people suggested Matthew had been in an accident somewhere far from where people were looking, that his car was in a ditch or ravine that hadn't been searched. Others whispered that Matthew had run away, maybe had debts he hadn't told Linda about, maybe had another woman. But those who knew Matthew rejected these theories. Matthew wasn't secretive. Matthew didn't have debts. Matthew loved his family. The most persistent theory, the one Linda believed, was that Matthew had driven off the road into Kentucky Lake during the rainstorm. The roads were slick, visibility was poor, a moment of inattention, a slight overcorrection in a curve, and the Beetle could have plunged into the water before Matthew could react. The car would have sunk quickly. The rear-engine Beetle had a tendency to go nose first into water. Matthew could have been trapped, unable to escape, and drowned in minutes. But if that was what happened, where was the car? Kentucky Lake had been searched. At least the obvious locations had been checked. Where else could he be? The answer, investigators eventually concluded, was that the lake was simply too large, the bottom too irregular, the visibility too poor, and the technology too limited. Highway 60 curved along the lake for miles, with hundreds of potential points where a car could leave the road. They had focused their limited diving resources on locations where there was visible evidence: broken guardrails, disturbed soil, damaged vegetation. But if a car went into the water at a location where rain had washed away the evidence within hours, where the embankment was naturally bare of vegetation, there would be no way to identify that specific spot among hundreds of similar curves. Without better technology, without a specific location to search, finding Matthew's car was impossible. Matthew Smith's disappearance became one of those cases that a community couldn't solve or forget. The Blue Beetle became legendary. For years afterward, people would report seeing it driving on Highway 60 late at night, parked at the lake at dawn, always just out of reach, always vanishing when approached. The ghost car of Kentucky Lake, people called it. But it wasn't a ghost. It was 18 feet underwater, less than a quarter mile from where Highway 60 curved along the lake's edge, sitting upright on the bottom, in a location that had never been thoroughly searched because the shoreline there showed no obvious signs of disturbance after the rain. The impact on the Smith family was devastating. Linda was 31 years old, suddenly a single mother with a 3-year-old son and no clear answers about what had happened to her husband. She received Matthew's life insurance payout after he was declared legally dead in 1975, 7 years after his disappearance. The money helped, but it couldn't fill the void. Danny Smith grew up with a father-shaped hole in his life. He had fragmentary memories, being lifted up to see inside engines, the smell of oil and metal, his father's rough hands gentle when they touched him. But mostly, Danny remembered absence. He remembered other kids having fathers.
Jennifer and Marcus descended together, following their dive computers down to 18 feet, then beginning to swim in a search pattern parallel to the old roadbed they could see on the bottom. The roadbed, probably Highway 60 before the lake was created, was visible as a depression in the sediment, still showing faint traces of its former surface. At 9:47 in the morning, Marcus spotted something ahead that caught his attention, a shape that didn't match the natural contours of the lake bottom. He signaled to Jennifer and swam toward it. As they approached, the shape resolved into something unmistakable, a car sitting upright on the bottom, oriented perpendicular to the old roadbed, as if it had driven straight off the road and into the water. The car was heavily covered in algae and sediment, but the distinctive shape was clear. It was a Volkswagen Beetle. Marcus's first thought was that this was a junk car dumped in the lake decades ago, but as he swam closer, he realized the car was more intact than he'd expected. The windows were mostly gone, dissolved or broken over the decades. The doors were closed. The body showed significant corrosion, but maintained its shape. And when he shone his dive light into the interior, he saw what made his blood run cold. Human bones scattered throughout the driver's compartment, but concentrated where the driver's seat would have been. A skull resting at an angle near the floor, ribs partially buried in sediment, long bones that had once been arms and legs, now disarticulated and lying among the corroded springs of the seat. The seatbelt was still there, though deteriorated, its attachment point still fastened, creating a rough boundary that showed where the body had originally been positioned before decomposition allowed the bones to collapse and scatter. Marcus immediately signaled for the dive team to surface. Protocol for finding human remains underwater was clear. Don't touch anything, mark the location with a surface buoy, notify authorities immediately. At 10:15 in the morning, Marcus made the call to 911 from the dive boat. "This is Marcus Webb with Blue Water Divers. We found a submerged vehicle with human remains in Kentucky Lake. We need the police and the coroner." The McCracken County Sheriff's Office responded first, arriving at the boat launch in Aurora within 30 minutes. Kentucky State Police followed. By early afternoon, a full recovery operation was being organized. The recovery took 3 days to complete. Underwater recovery specialists from the state police dove to the site on August 16th, documenting everything with underwater cameras before attempting to move the vehicle. They carefully collected the skeletal remains, placing each bone in separate evidence bags with detailed documentation of where each piece was found. The cold water and the layer of sediment that had covered parts of the interior had helped preserve the bones, though they were fragile and required delicate handling. They attached lift bags to the Beetle, and with the help of a crane barge, slowly raised the car to the surface on August 18th. As the Blue Beetle broke the surface for the first time in Audug-Hyber 47 years, water pouring from every opening, gasps went up from the gathered crowd of officials, media, and curious onlookers. The car showed the ravages of nearly 5 decades underwater. The metal was heavily corroded, with holes rusted through in several places. The paint was mostly gone, but in protected areas beneath layers of algae and sediment, traces of light blue were still visible. The interior was largely deteriorated, with the seats reduced to springs and fragments of material. The license plate, though heavily corroded and partially disintegrated, was still attached to the rear bumper.
With careful cleaning, investigators could make out enough of the stamped numbers, PCH 847, Kentucky, with traces of the 1968 registration sticker barely visible. But the most crucial identifier was still intact, the VIN number, stamped into the metal of the chassis in multiple locations. These numbers, protected by their depth in the metal itself, were still readable after careful cleaning. 115578249, a 1965 Volkswagen Beetle. Detective Sarah Johnson, now the lead investigator for the cold case unit, recognized the significance immediately. She had read the old case files when she joined the unit 5 years earlier. She knew about Matthew Smith, the mechanic who had vanished in 1968 driving a blue VW Beetle with license plate PCH 847. "We found him," she said quietly. "After 47 years, we found him." The car was transported to a state police facility where forensic examination could be conducted. The medical examiner, Dr. Richard Foster, examined the remains thoroughly over the next several days. The bones were those of an adult male, and based on the length of the long bones, the individual had been approximately 5'8" to 5'10" in height, consistent with Matthew's recorded height of 5'9". Dental records became the primary means of identification. Matthew's dentist in Paducah had closed his practice in 1989, but his records had been transferred to a storage facility and were still accessible. The dental records showed distinctive features: a crown on the upper left molar, fillings in specific teeth, and a slightly crooked lower incisor that Matthew had never had corrected. Dr. Foster compared the skull's teeth to the dental records. The match was perfect. Every filling, every crown, every distinctive feature was present exactly as recorded in 1965, the last time Matthew had visited his dentist. These were definitively the remains of Matthew Allen Smith. For a final confirmation, Detective Johnson requested a DNA sample. Though the skeletal remains had been underwater for 47 years, small amounts of DNA could still be extracted from the interior of teeth and from the densest parts of the bones. The DNA analysis took 3 weeks, but when the results came back, they confirmed what the dental records had already proven. These were the remains of Matthew Allen Smith, and Danny Smith was his biological son. The VIN number from the Beetle was cross-referenced with Volkswagen's manufacturing records and with the registration documents on file with Kentucky's Department of Motor Vehicles. The car was definitively identified as the 1965 Beetle that Matthew Smith had purchased new from a Paducah dealership in May 1965. But the most crucial identifier came from examining the car itself and its position in the lake. Forensic investigators could reconstruct with reasonable accuracy what had happened on March 15, 1968. The investigation into how Matthew Smith ended up at the bottom of Kentucky Lake revealed a tragic sequence of events that could have been prevented with better luck, better visibility, or just a few more seconds of reaction time. The examination of the Beetle and the lake bottom where it was found told a clear story. The car had entered the water at a specific point along Highway 60, about 4.5 miles east of Paducah, where the road made a gentle curve to the right along the lake's edge. In 1968, at that location, there was no guardrail. The road simply ended at a small shoulder, perhaps 3 feet wide, and then a steep embankment dropped 8 to 10 feet directly into the water. Today, in 2015, that section of road had a guardrail installed, sometime in the 1970s, after several accidents. But in March 1968, there was nothing to stop a car that left the pavement. The position of the car on the lake bottom, perpendicular to the old roadbed, indicated it had gone straight off the road rather than sliding sideways. The lack of any gouges in the old embankment suggested the car was moving at moderate speed, not racing. The absence of skid marks on the pavement above, documented in photos during the recovery, indicated Matthew hadn't been braking before leaving the road. Therapists, I realized, collected water draining from the higher sections of road. March 15, 1968 had seen steady rain throughout the afternoon, and the curve would have collected water draining from the higher sections of road. When the Beetle hit that standing water, the tires would have lost contact with the pavement for just a second or two, a phenomenon called hydroplaning. During those critical seconds, the steering would have been ineffective, By the time the tires regained traction, the car was already off course. On a curve with no margin for error, with the lake just feet away from the pavement, those few seconds were enough. The Beetle went over the embankment and into the water. Based on the car's design, with its engine in the rear, it would have floated for perhaps 15 to 20 seconds, the rear end low in the water, while trapped air in the body kept it from sinking immediately. But water would have poured in through the floor vents around the doors. As the car filled, it would have tipped forward and sunk quickly, nose first.
Matthew was trapped. At 18 feet depth, the water pressure would have made the doors impossible to open without equalizing the pressure first, something that requires training and calm that Matthew, suddenly plunged into cold water in a sinking car, wouldn't have had. The windows, already difficult to roll down in a Beetle, would have been useless, and opening them would only have flooded the car faster. The Beetle settled to the bottom in 18 feet of cold water, landing upright in a slight depression in the lake floor. Matthew drowned, still sitting in his driver's seat, still belted in, probably within 5 to 8 minutes of leaving the U-road. The reason no one found the car in 1968 was now clear. The curve where Matthew went off the road showed no obvious signs of disturbance. There were no skid marks because he hadn't been braking. The embankment at that point was naturally bare of vegetation because of the steep slope and frequent wave action from the lake. Any tire marks in the soft shoulder would have been washed away by the rain that continued for hours after the accident. When search boats had patrolled the shoreline in March 1968 looking for evidence of a car entering the water, this location appeared no different from hundreds of other curves along Highway 60. There was no broken guardrail because there was no guardrail. There was no disturbed vegetation because there was no vegetation at that spot. There was nothing to indicate this particular curve among dozens of similar curves was the one where Matthew had left the road. The search efforts in 1968 had been focused on locations where there was visible evidence, areas with damaged guardrails, broken vegetation, or reports from witnesses who thought they'd heard something. This particular spot had none of those markers. Danny Smith was notified on August 18, 2015, that his father had been found. He was 50 years old, the same age his father would have been in 1968 if he'd lived 18 more years. Danny drove to the state police facility and stood looking at the corroded blue Beetle, now sitting in a forensics bay, still dripping lake water. "This is what he loved," Danny said to Detective Johnson, "this car. He poured his heart into it, and it became his tomb." The funeral was held on September 5, 2015, 47 years and 6 months after Matthew disappeared. Over 200 people attended, a mixture of Matthew's surviving friends, all now elderly, members of the community who remembered the case, and Danny's family. Linda's sister, now 78, spoke tearfully about her sister, who had waited her entire life for this day, but died just a year too soon to see it. Matthew was buried in Oak Grove Cemetery next to Linda's grave in the plot she had purchased 40 years earlier. The marker read Matthew A. Smith, 1936 to 1968. Beloved husband and father, lost but never forgotten. Together again with Linda, 1937 to 2014. Danny decided not to restore the Blue Beetle, but instead to preserve it as it was found, as a memorial and educational exhibit. He donated it to the McCracken County Historical Society. It now sits in a climate-controlled display in a museum in Paducah, with a detailed placard telling Matthew's story. The talented mechanic who loved cars more than anything except his family, who disappeared on a rainy afternoon in 1968, and who was finally found 47 years later, still in his driver's seat 18 feet below the surface of Kentucky Lake. The discovery led to changes in how Kentucky manages missing person cases involving possible water submersion.
The state police cold case unit now works with civilian diving clubs, maintaining a database of unidentified vehicles found in Kentucky's many lakes and rivers, and providing funding for sonar equipment and trained dive teams. Since 2015, 12 other missing person cases have been solved when submerged vehicles were found, either by law enforcement using better technology or by recreational divers who now know to report any vehicles they encounter underwater. Danny Smith, who runs Smith & Son Auto Repair, keeps a photograph of his father's blue Beetle on his office wall. Not the corroded version in the museum, but a photo from 1965 when the car was new, Matthew standing beside it, proud smile on his face, hand resting on the hood. He built that car to last, Danny told an interviewer in 2016, and in a way it did last. It sat there for 47 years, protecting his remains, making sure he could finally be found and brought home. That car kept its promise to him. The case of Matthew Smith serves as a reminder of how easily accidents happen, how quickly lives can change, and how mysteries can persist for decades simply because no one looked in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Matthew didn't die because he was reckless. He died because of a split second of bad luck, a patch of water on a curve, a missing guardrail, and a car that sank 18 feet into cold water where no one thought to search thoroughly. For 47 years, Matthew sat in that blue Beetle at the bottom of Kentucky Lake, less than 5 miles from his home, from his shop, from the life he'd built. His wife lived and died, never knowing he was so close. His son grew up and grew old, always wondering, and the lake kept it secret until recreational divers with modern equipment finally looked in the right place. The mystery of Matthew Smith's disappearance is solved. Now the blue Beetle that vanished in 1968 has been found. The mechanic who loved cars more than anything except his family finally came home. But the tragedy remains. A life ended too soon, a family shattered, and 47 years of questions that should have been answered in 1968.